Hey folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things, and there's a new electric blue hedgehog game coming out soon, so I thought this would be a great opportunity to make a little Sonic sculpture of my own. Now, I wasn't really sure which version of Sonic I wanted to make since I'm a sucker for views and the movie version feels like free real estate, but I also just really like the simplicity of the original design. For artistic reasons, of course, not because I'm a lazy artist who just wants to do the bare minimum amount of work. Now, this mental back and forth flip-flopping is a recurring theme throughout this video, but I think it's a good window into how I actually like to plan for a project ahead of time, or, more specifically, how little I actually think these things through. For instance, I thought maybe it would be a good idea to run some wire through the body in case I wanted to connect some lights somewhere along the way. Spoiler alert though, I never did. I did, however, notice this little albino-looking Sonic fella on my clay packaging that took me down a very different path. I also figured that YouTube is inundated with copious amounts of incredibly awesome movie versions of Sonics that are full of lights and lightning, and I couldn't help but wonder if anyone really wants to see me make a subpar version of somebody else's already awesome work. So I scrapped the lightning quills and LED eyes and decided to try something a little different. Of course, before we can get to that something a little bit different, I need to actually make myself a Sonic, which brings us to the present, which is me making a little body with long noodly arms and legs. Now, once I've got those noodles smoothed and blended into the OG Naruto Run pose, I can stick a little tail onto the butt area and then mount it on a block of wood so that I can get to work adding the finer details, starting with his little red running shoes. At this point, I think I've crammed as much detail into his shoes as I'm gonna get, so I think it's time to make some gloves. As I mentioned before, it's a little acknowledged fact that what the internet obsessively calls the Naruto Run maybe ought to be called the Sonic Sprint, since Sonic was doing the arms back, head forward power run a full year before Naruto even hit the scene. Now, none of this is really relevant to how I make my gloves, but I was radio silent for almost a minute while I made Sonic shoes, and sometimes I worry that if I'm not talking, my heart might stop. Also, someone left a comment on one of my older videos asking me why I talk through the entire process, and I think it's because while some artists like to let their work speak for itself, if I do that, there's every possibility that my work would just babble incoherently while drooling on itself, so I like to give it a little conversational help along the way. To that end, I finished making my pair of oversized gloved hedgehog fists, and I can slip them onto the tip of my long noodly arms, blend them in, and then add the folded wrist sleeve things. Otherwise, that's Sonic's lower half all but finished, and I can get to work making his head. I'll start with a ball of clay, then slowly build up the cheeks and eye ridges, trying my damnedest to stay somewhat character accurate. Sonic is very much one of those characters that can quickly dip into the uncanny valley if you deviate too far from the correct proportions, and if there's one thing that encapsulates that patented north-of-the-border jankiness, it's wonky proportions. So I'm really trying to make sure everything looks, well, not just good, but good enough.
He said it! He said it!
Once I've got the overall shape sorted out, I can start to grumpy up his eyebrows and add some deeper furrows in his brow. Normally I wouldn't give Sonic such overly exaggerated wrinkles, but when I add the fur later, it'll fill in all the furrows, so I'm hoping that by going a bit OTT with them now, they should look better in the finished furred face. Then I can give him a cheeky little smile, add a bit of a corner wrinkle, and stick his ears in place. This was actually the first of probably 3 or 4 attempts at the ears over the course of sculpting Sonic, since they never really seemed to sit quite right, and I think that's because I kept adding them too far back on his head, whereas his actual ears sit pretty far forward and angled downwards. Then I can poke a divot for his future snoot before giving him a nice alcohol-based bath. This removes any of the fingerprints and helps to smooth the surface. Then it's finally time to add his quills or hair or tentacles or, I don't know, whatever the fleshy blue protuberances at the back of his head are. Now to make adding the fur easier, I'm going to completely finish his body and his head separately, then attach them back together at the end. However, I want to make sure that it's as seamless as possible, so once his head spikes are in place, I'll temporarily attach his head to his body so that I can line up the spiky dealies on his back. Now once I've got them stuck in place and temporarily affixed, I can do what Dr. Eggman never could and decapitate Sonic. This will let me smooth the rest of his spikes and bake his head and body separately before moving on to the painting. Most of his body is going to be covered in fur, but I want to lay down a base coat with the correct color so that any spots where the fur hasn't stuck properly won't be quite as noticeable, or if they are noticeable, then I can say that I was going for a more authentic, battle-scarred Sonic look, and that was always my intention. Of course, his eyes aren't going to be covered in fur, so I want to take a few extra minutes to make sure they look correct, then I can coat them in a layer of UV resin before moving on to painting his gloves and boots. I'll give everything a base coat of white, then dirty up that white by giving it a gray wash, followed by a heavy dry brushing of more white to create a little contrast and shading. Then I'll paint his shoes a nice shiny red, and I can mask off his eyes using a little sticky tack. Finally, with the eyes masked off and everything painted, I'm ready to add the fur. Now this is the same method using the same magic machine that I used to make my real-life Pikachu a few weeks ago. That thing turned out pretty neat, and I had all this blue flock just begging to be used, so I thought why not try to make it with Sonic. What I don't have though is the off-white flock that goes around his chin and belly, so I'm gonna have to try and make some of my own. Now if I wanted to mix up the color I was after using paint, I just mixed brown and yellow with a bunch of white. And because the fibers of this flock are so fine, I can pretty much mix any colors I want together in the same way to get very similar results. So starting with a little yellow, a little brown, and a whole bunch of white, I'm left with this perfect shade of light beige.
Wow.
Now if there's one thing I learned from last time, it's that this gets everywhere, so I built myself a high-tech collection unit using an old cardboard box. I'll use a bit of window screen to help sieve out the clumpy bits of my grass, making sure to get a big enough pile in the center of the static box. And just so you can appreciate how important the cardboard box is, I'll stick a little black sheet at the back so you can see the yellow fibers doing their thing. Then it's just a case of painting some PVA glue onto Sonic's face where I want the fur to stick, turning on the box, and watching the magic happen. Oh, and maybe watch your fingers.
I'm in danger!
Otherwise, the static box charges the flock, causing it to stand on end, giving Sonic a pretty convincing 5 o'clock shadow. Any of the loose fibers can be brushed off, then I can paint his belly with glue and repeat the process for his body. Once I've finished with the beard and chest hair, I can clean up the yellow fibers, add some blue, and then give Sonic a proper coat of fur. Once the glue's dried, I can pull the tanning goggles off Sonic's eyes and clean up the light-colored bits using my airbrush. I haven't quite mastered this fur technique, and I'm not sure how to keep the darker fibers from getting tangled in the lighter fibers, since there's no way to mask it off. Otherwise, the only thing left to do is glue Sonic's little black nose in place and attach his head to his body. With that though, Sonic is looking pretty good, so all that's left to do is build him a base. I'll start by cutting out a small section of foam, then carefully applying some texture. Then I can give it a nice dirty brown base coat. Now I've used blue static grass for Sonic's fur, so I figured some nice green static grass for the grass would make a nice contrast. I'll start with a nice thick layer of short 3mm grass before applying another layer of longer 6mm, which will leave me with a nice varied grassy base. Then I can scrape away a little section for Sonic's foot, drop a dollop of hot glue down, then stick him in place. Finally, once I've pressed the grass around his foot, we're all finished here and onto the Glamour Shots. As always, a big old thank you to my wonderful patrons and a special shout out to my newest patrons, Bubble Beluga, Bloody Wild Witch, Ollie Bearmeister, William Fowler, Pirate Angel Baby, Mara, Yasmin Matthews, Talon Richards, Jackie VT, Amy Hales, Anna, Gibble Monster, Johnman927, Jeremy E, Get Spooky, Penn Stift, David Ingram, Paula Barcellos, The Big Sturgeski, Ashley Bauer, Tiffany Wood, Mr. Lee, Jay Han, Lord of Cats, Robert Menke, Annika Van Reness, and Demonic Cat. You are the tiny blue fibers that now coat the inside of my lungs. As always, if you subscribe to like, then be sure to video the notification, and as always, comment on that smash. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Cheers.